The morning air cuts through the barracks like a blade. It's cold, February cold, the kind that makes breath visible and fingers stiff. She's been awake for hours, lying rigid on the thin mattress, staring at wooden planks above her head. Around her, other women shift restlessly in the pre-dawn darkness. No one speaks. They've learned that silence feels safer than conversation. Then it happens. A scent drifts through the gap beneath the barracks door. Warm, rich, unmistakable. The smell of bacon frying somewhere beyond these walls, carried on the frozen air like a message from another world. She closes her eyes, and for a moment, the smell transports her so violently backward in time that she forgets where she is. Sunday mornings, her mother's kitchen, the sizzle in the cast iron pan, steam fogging the window. A life that feels like it belonged to someone else entirely. But that's impossible. There hasn't been bacon in Germany for years. The scent is so foreign, so unexpected in this place, that it feels more shocking than the moment American soldiers first pointed their rifles at her chest. She opens her eyes. The woman in the next bunk has lifted her head, nostrils flaring slightly, her expression caught between disbelief and something that looks dangerously like hope. Why does a simple smell feel more shocking than capture itself? Why does the scent of breakfast frying in an enemy camp crack something open inside her chest that terror couldn't touch? This is the story of how propaganda collapses, not through grand speeches or dramatic revelations, but through the quiet devastation of a warm scent on a cold morning. This is about what happens when everything you've been told about the enemy turns out to be wrong, and that wrongness arrives not as an argument, but as the smell of food you haven't encountered in years. This is about bacon, yes, but it's also about memory, humanity, and the strange places where both survive even in war. Let's go back. Back before the capture, before the camp, before that morning. Back to the world these women came from, because you can't understand the weight of that bacon smell without first understanding the hunger, the real hunger, and the propaganda hunger that preceded it. Germany, late 1944 and into early 1945. The home front is collapsing in slow motion, like a building settling into its own foundation. Food has become an obsession, a daily calculus of survival. Ration cards control everything: bread, butter, meat, eggs. But the cards promise more than the shops can deliver. Women wait in lines that stretch around corners, stamping feet against the cold, only to find the shelves empty when their turn finally comes. The word ersatz has taken over the language. Ersatz coffee made from roasted acorns, ersatz bread bulked out with sawdust and potato peels. Ersatz everything, because the real things have vanished into the machinery of war. There's a joke that goes around, bitter and tired. What's the difference between a German housewife and a magician? The magician can make something out of nothing. The housewife has to make dinner. Bacon? Real bacon? Thick cut and fatty, sizzling in its own grease? That's a memory from before, from the time when Germany was winning, when the newsreels showed tanks rolling across Europe and the announce was promised that sacrifice now meant abundance later. That abundance never came. Instead came soup so thin you could see the bottom of the bowl through it. Bread so dark and dense it sat in your stomach like a stone. The absence of cooking smells in apartment buildings because there was nothing to cook. For women serving in auxiliary units, communications, administration, support roles near the front lines, the shortages felt even sharper. They were supposed to embody the strength of the Reich, disciplined and devoted, yet they lived on watery stews and black bread while being told that their suffering was noble. The propaganda wrapped around them like barbed wire. It told them who they were. It told them what the enemy would do to them if they were captured. The Americans, they told them, were monsters in human skin, brutal, savage. The propaganda films showed them as criminals released from prisons and sent to Europe to rape and murder. The pamphlets described atrocities in detail, designed to terrify. If you were captured, the messages said, you will face horrors worse than death. The Soviet threat was emphasized most heavily, but the Americans weren't portrayed as much better. Soldiers without discipline, men without morality, a force of chaos and violence. These women absorbed these messages because they had no choice. The propaganda wasn't just posters and radio broadcasts, it was whispered in barracks, repeated by officers, reinforced by rumors that swept through units like contagion. Every woman knew someone who had heard about what happened when the enemy took prisoners. The stories grew in the telling, fed by fear and exhaustion, and the knowledge that Germany was losing, that the lines were collapsing, that soon there would be nowhere left to retreat. So they lived in a world of double hunger: physical hunger that made their bodies weak and their thoughts slow, and psychological hunger, hunger for safety, for certainty, for a future that didn't end in violence. The hunger for fat, for meat, for the smell of real food became tangled with the hunger for survival itself. Their bodies remembered abundance as their minds tried to prepare for capture. The sensory landscape of their lives had become one of absence. No rich cooking smells, no sizzle of fat in a pan, no steam rising from a roast. Just cold rooms and thin soup and the constant gnawing awareness that their own government could no longer feed them while demanding they continue to serve. This is what starvation does. It doesn't just weaken the body, it hollows out the soul, makes every moment about the next meal, the next crust of bread, the next promise that never arrives. And then came the day the world changed. The capture itself happens faster than expected. One moment there's frantic activity, officers shouting orders, papers being burned, vehicles being abandoned. Then the silence. Then the sound of engines, different from German vehicles, lower and steadier. American engines. Boots on gravel. Voices calling out in English, the words intelligible, but the tone strangely calm, almost businesslike. She raises her hands, the white cloth tied to a stick trembling in her grip. Her heart pounds so hard she can feel it in her throat. This is the moment she's been trained to fear. This is when everything she's been told will be proven true or false, and she doesn't know which possibility terrifies her more. Around her, other women stand frozen, hands raised, faces pale. The American soldiers approach with rifles ready, but not pointed directly at them. They're young, most of them, boys really, with dirty faces and tired eyes. One of them says something she doesn't understand. His voice isn't angry. It isn't cruel. It's just a voice. Another soldier gestures for them to move, and they do, stumbling over their own feet, waiting for violence that doesn't come.
The confusion is immediate and disorienting. This isn't matching the script. Where's the brutality? Where's the chaos? Instead, there's an almost methodical efficiency. Names are taken, belongings are searched but not stolen. They're loaded onto trucks with canvas covers, sitting on benches while the vehicles bounce over rutted roads. No one speaks. The fear is still there, thick and choking, but it's beginning to change flavor. It's becoming the fear of not knowing, of expectations unmet, of a story that's supposed to unfold one way but seems to be going somewhere else entirely. They arrive at the POW camp in late afternoon. The light is failing, turning everything gray and cold. But even in the dimness, she can see that this place is organized. Fences are straight, buildings are orderly. American flags hang from poles, snapping in the wind. Guards stand at posts, watching but not menacing. Everything has a structure to it, a logic, as if this camp is a small functioning city rather than the hellscape she'd imagined. The intake process is clinical. They're registered, their information recorded on forms. A medic examines each woman, checking eyes, throat, asking questions through a translator about injuries or illnesses. The medic's hands are gentle, professional. When one woman flinches at his touch, he steps back, speaks softly to the translator, waits for permission before continuing. This small gesture, this respect, lands like a blow. They're assigned to barracks. The buildings are wooden, plain, but clean. The bunks have thin mattresses, but also blankets that smell of soap rather than sweat and fear. There's a stove in the center of the room, unlit but present. Windows with glass, a door that closes. It's not comfortable, not by any stretch, but it's not the nightmare they'd prepared for. As darkness falls completely, they sit on their bunks in silence. Some women cry quietly, others stare at nothing. The fear hasn't disappeared, it's just transformed into something more complex. Uncertainty mixed with exhaustion, mixed with the first dangerous whispers of relief. They'd survived the day. Nothing terrible has happened, but the night is long and sleep comes in fragments, broken by every sound, every footstep outside. And then morning comes. She wakes before dawn, as she has every day for months. Old habits die hard. The barracks is cold, frost forming on the inside of the windows. She can see her breath. Around her, other women are stirring, shifting under thin blankets, reluctant to face another day. No one knows what will happen now, what the routine will be, what demands will be made. Then the smell arrives. It doesn't announce itself, it just appears, seeping under the door, drifting through the cracks, filling the space between heartbeats. Bacon, real bacon, unmistakable in its richness, the scent of fat rendering, of meat crisping at the edges, of protein and salts and abundance. The smell carries weight, texture, memory. She freezes, hands halfway to pulling on her boots. For a moment, she thinks she's imagining it. Hunger does strange things to the mind, conjures phantom meals, tricks the senses. But no, the woman in the next bunk has lifted her head, nostrils flaring, and her expression mirrors what must be on her own face. Shock, disbelief, and underneath, rising like water through cracked earth, something that feels dangerously like hunger that's suddenly specific, suddenly focused on something real rather than the abstract gnawing that's become background noise. The smell grows stronger as morning progresses. Somewhere beyond these walls, in a kitchen they haven't seen, Americans are cooking breakfast. Not ersatz anything, not thin soup or dark bread. Bacon. Real bacon, the kind that hasn't existed in Germany for years, the kind that belongs to a different life, a different world. She closes her eyes and the smell rebuilds her mother's kitchen with painful clarity. Sunday mornings before the war, the cast iron skillet on the stove, her mother standing there in her house dress, hair pinned up, turning strips with a fork, the windows fogging from the heat, the table already set, her father reading the newspaper, her brother stealing a piece straight from the pan and getting his hand swatted for it. The normalcy of it all, the careless abundance of it all, the assumption that there would always be more Sundays, more bacon, more mornings like this. The smell is so powerful it makes her dizzy. Or maybe that's just hunger, actual physical hunger sharpening into something acute and demanding. But it's not just about wanting food, it's about what the food represents. The smell of bacon means someone somewhere nearby has access to fresh meat, has access to enough fresh meat to cook it for breakfast, casually, routinely, has access to fuel to cook with, to pans to cook in, to a kitchen that functions, has access to abundance. And that someone is the enemy. The cognitive dissonance hits like a physical blow. These are the Americans, the ones that she's been told are barely civilized, violent, unrestrained, the ones who are supposed to be starving in their own country, desperate and brutal. Yet they're cooking bacon for breakfast, while Germany, proud Germany, organized Germany, disciplined Germany, hasn't had real bacon for its citizens in years. She looks around the barracks. Every woman is awake now, sitting up. Some still pulling on clothes, but all of them arrested by the same smell. No one speaks. What would they say? How do you talk about the moment when everything you've been told begins to crack, when propaganda meets reality, and reality smells like Sunday morning? One of the women starts to cry. Not loud, just tears sliding down her cheeks while she sits perfectly still. Another woman laughs, a short, bitter sound that dies quickly. A third just shakes her head slowly, over and over, as if trying to deny what her own nose is telling her. The door opens. An American soldier stands there, young and informal in a way that German soldiers were never. He says something in English, gestures for them to come out. Time for what yet? They don't know. But they file out into the cold morning air, and the smell of bacon is even stronger out here, unmistakable and overwhelming. They're led to a mess hall. The building is warm, actually warm, heated in a way they haven't experienced in months. Long tables with benches, a serving line where other prisoners are already waiting with metal trays. The smell is everywhere now, mixing with coffee, real coffee, not ersatz, and fresh bread. She feels her stomach clench painfully. The line moves forward. She receives a tray, moves down the line. An American cook, a large man with a stained apron, serves her. Scrambled eggs, pale yellow and steaming. Toast, white bread, soft and fresh. And yes, bacon, 3 strips of it, still glistening with fat, laid across the tray.
She stares at it. This isn't possible. This has to be a mistake, some kind of trick. Prisoners don't get fed like this. Prisoners get scraps, get punishment rations, get just enough to stay alive and working. That's how it works. That's the logic of war. But here's the bacon on her tray, undeniably real. She sits at a table with other German women. For a long moment, no one eats. They just look at their trays, at the food that shouldn't exist, at the abundance that makes no sense. Then, tentatively, someone picks up a fork, takes a small bite of eggs, chews slowly, swallows, doesn't die, doesn't get sick. The eggs are just eggs. Good eggs. She picks up a strip of bacon with her fingers. It's still warm. The fat has soaked into her skin. She bites into it, and the taste explodes across her tongue. Salt and smoke and richness, fat coating her mouth, the texture both crispy and tender. It tastes exactly like memory and nothing like the war. For a moment, she forgets everything else. There's just the bacon, just this bite, just this moment of her body receiving something it desperately needed. Around her, other women are eating now, some slowly and carefully, others with a hunger that's almost violent in its intensity. Some are crying while they eat, tears dripping onto their trays. The bacon isn't just food, it's proof. Proof that everything they've been told is wrong. Proof that the enemy has what Germany cannot provide. Proof that captivity might be safer than the freedom they left behind. This is the moral whiplash. This is the moment when ideology meets reality, and ideology shatters like glass. They'd prepared for violence, for degradation, for suffering. They'd steeled themselves to endure horrors. Instead, they're eating bacon. The enemy is feeding them better than their own government fed civilians. The enemy is treating them with a casual humanity that their own leadership never managed. The psychological impact is devastating in ways that violence might not have been. Violence would have been expected. It would have confirmed everything they believed. It would have let them remain who they were, German women suffering at the hands of brutal Americans. But kindness? Abundance? The basic decency of a warm meal? That destroys the framework entirely. She finishes the bacon slowly, making it last, and with each bite, she feels something inside her shifting. Not gratitude, not exactly, something more complicated. Shame, maybe? Confusion, definitely. And underneath everything, a terrible question that she's not ready to face. If the Americans aren't who she was told they are, what else was a lie? And if her own government lied about this, what else did they lie about? The bacon becomes symbolic in ways that transcend nutrition. It represents American abundance, not theoretical abundance, not propaganda abundance, but real, tangible, everyday abundance. The kind of abundance that lets an army cook bacon for prisoners. The kind of abundance that treats feeding the enemy as routine rather than sacrifice. This abundance speaks to industrial capacity, to agricultural might, to a homeland that isn't starving, to a society that functions even while fighting a war on two fronts. The bacon also represents stability. In Germany, food has become chaos. Ration cards that promise nothing, shops with empty shelves, the constant uncertainty of where the next meal will come from. Here, in this camp, breakfast happens every morning, the same time, the same routine, the same abundance. There's a reliability to it that feels almost absurd. The enemy has created more stability for German prisoners than Germany created for its own people. And perhaps most significantly, the bacon represents a life not controlled by terror. In the Reich, everything became about fear. Fear of neighbors, fear of authorities, fear of saying the wrong thing or failing to say the right thing, fear of the future, of the bombs, of the advancing armies, fear that permeated every moment, every decision. But here, having breakfast is just having breakfast. The American guards don't hover, don't threaten, don't turn mealtime into a demonstration of power. They just let the prisoners eat. It's the ordinariness of it that's shocking. She begins to understand, sitting in that mess hall with grease still on her fingers, that she's crossed into a different world. Not geographically, she's still in Germany probably, or not far from it, but psychologically, ideologically, she's entered a space where the rules she learned don't apply, where the enemy isn't an enemy in the way she understood enemies to be, where captivity might mean something other than suffering. The realization is terrifying. If the Americans aren't monsters, what does that make her? What does that make Germany? What was she serving? What was she defending? These questions don't come all at once. They arrive in pieces, in fragments, in moments of recognition that she pushes away because they're too large, too complicated, too dangerous. But the bacon smell keeps triggering them, keeps bringing them back. Every morning when breakfast comes, when that scent drifts through the barracks, she remembers. And remembering forces thinking, and thinking forces questioning. Over the following days, the pattern repeats. Breakfast, lunch, dinner, regular meals, predictable portions. The quality varies, some meals are better than others, but there's always food, always enough. The abundance becomes routine, and that routine becomes its own kind of education. She watches the American guards. They're casual in a way that German soldiers never were. They laugh, they smoke, they play cards on their breaks. They treat guarding the prisoners as a job rather than a mission. When prisoners have questions, the guards answer if they can, shrug if they can't.
There's no theatrical cruelty, no demonstration of superiority, just men doing a job, counting the hours until their shifts end. The camp itself reveals more contradictions. There's a medical clinic where a doctor treats prisoners' ailments, not elaborate care, but competent, efficient treatment. Antibiotics for infections, bandages for wounds, basic respect for human suffering. The doctor is an older man who speaks some German. He's matter-of-fact, professional. When a woman thanks him, almost reflexively, he just nods and moves to the next patient. It's routine for him. This is just what doctors do. There's a laundry where clothes can be washed, not often and not perfectly, but regularly enough that the smell of unwashed bodies gradually fades. Clean clothes feel like dignity returning in small increments. There's showers, cold water, rough soap, but showers nonetheless. The opportunity to stand underwater and feel momentarily human again. The barracks stay heated. Not warm, exactly, but above freezing. The stove gets wood regularly. At night, under thin blankets, she's cold but not dangerously so. She's slept in colder places while serving the Reich. That realization stings in ways she can't quite articulate. The rules of the camp are clear and consistently enforced. Stay within designated areas, attend roll call, follow instructions from guards, don't fight, don't steal. The rules are reasonable, and the enforcement is proportional. Break a minor rule, get a verbal warning. Break a major rule, lose privileges. There's no arbitrary violence, no capricious punishment. The system makes sense. It's predictable. And predictability, she's learning, is a form of kindness all its own.
Small interactions accumulate. A guard helps a woman struggling to carry a bucket of water. Not making a show of it, just noticing someone struggling and offering a hand. A cook, seeing prisoners eyeing the kitchen, brings out extra bread one afternoon. Doesn't say anything, just leaves it on a table and walks away. These moments aren't dramatic. They don't feel calculated. They're just human. People being decent because being decent is the default, not the exception. She finds herself comparing everything to life under the Reich. The comparison is involuntary, unwelcome, but persistent. In Germany, especially toward the end, everything was harsh. Discipline was brutal. Mistakes were punished severely. Questioning was forbidden. Everyone was exhausted, terrified, living on edge. The weight of ideology pressed down on every interaction, making nothing simple, nothing casual, nothing human, without also being political. Here, ideology seems almost absent. The Americans know she's German, know she's served the Reich, but they don't seem to care much about it personally. She's just one more prisoner in a camp full of prisoners. They're just guards doing a job. The war is something happening elsewhere, something abstract. This place exists in a strange bubble where breakfast gets cooked and prisoners get fed, and everyone just continues. It's almost surreal in its normality. But the normality is what breaks through. That's what propaganda can't withstand. Grand violence might have been processed, explained, fitted into the existing framework. But kindness, routine decency, bacon for breakfast, those things don't fit. They create cracks in the wall of certainty. And through those cracks, doubts begin to seep. She lies in her bunk at night and thinks about the women she served with who might still be free, still moving west ahead of the advancing armies, still hungry, still afraid, still believing everything they were told. She thinks about her family, if they're even alive, if they're eating anything at all. She thinks about the German soldiers in Soviet prisoner camps and the stories she's heard about those conditions, and wonders why captivity has such different meanings depending on who captures you. The guilt starts quietly, just small whispers at first. You're eating while others starve. You're safe while others flee. You're being treated humanely by people you were taught to hate, while your own people suffered under your own government. The guilt grows, fed by every meal, every small kindness, every moment of relative comfort. It's survivor's guilt mixed with something more complicated. The guilt of discovering you were wrong, that you believed lies, that you served something that didn't deserve service. One afternoon, a woman in her barracks starts talking. It breaks some unspoken rule of silence they've all maintained. But once she starts, others join in. Quiet conversations about home, about families, about what they've lost, about the propaganda they absorbed, about the things they saw but didn't question, about the slow horror of realization. I believed it. All of it. I believed we were right. I believed they were monsters. And now... She gestures vaguely at the camp around them. Now I don't know what I believe. Another woman nods. My brother died on the Eastern Front. They told us he died defending civilization, but if we're the civilized ones, why are the ones who ran out of food? Why are the ones who turned on our own people? Why are the Americans feeding us better than Germany fed us? The conversations are painful, tentative, circling around truths that are too large to fully confront. But they're happening. The bacon smell triggered something, and now it can't be stopped. The women are beginning to think, to question, to wonder. And once you start wondering, it's hard to stop. She doesn't participate much in these conversations. She mostly listens. But she's thinking the same things, feeling the same shame, facing the same realization that everything she thought she knew has been turned inside out by something as simple as breakfast. The war ends while they're still in the camp. The news arrives through guards, through rumors, through the general sense that something has shifted. Germany has surrendered. The Reich is finished. There's relief in the announcement, but also a strange emptiness. What now? What happens to German women in an American POW camp when there's no more war to fight? They're not released immediately. There's paperwork, processing, screening. The Allies want to determine who served where, who might be culpable for what. The interviews are thorough but not cruel. She answers questions honestly, too tired for anything else. She was a radio operator. She transmitted messages. She followed orders. She didn't kill anyone directly, but she was part of the machine that did. The interviewer, an American officer with tired eyes, writes down her answers. At the end, he asks if she has family to return to. She doesn't know. The last letter from home came 8 months ago. Anything could have happened since then. He nods, makes a note, dismisses her. The interaction is bureaucratic, impersonal, but not unkind. Just another day of processing prisoners in a war that's finally over. Weeks pass. Spring arrives, tentative and cool. The camp population fluctuates as prisoners are processed and released. She waits her turn. The routine continues. Meals at regular times, roll call, the small rhythms of camp life. The bacon smell comes every morning, no longer shocking, but familiar now. She's gotten used to it, and that fact itself is strange. How quickly humans adapt, how quickly the extraordinary becomes ordinary. When her release finally comes, she's given papers, rations for the journey, and directions to a displaced person's processing center. The guard who hands her the papers is young, probably no older than she is. He says good luck in accented but clear German. She nods, doesn't trust herself to speak, and walks out of the camp into a world that's both familiar and completely foreign. The journey home, if home even exists anymore, takes weeks. Trains that don't run on schedule, roads damaged by war, cities reduced to rubble. She passes through landscapes that look like the surface of the moon, cratered, smoking, emptied of life. Germany has been destroyed. The price of the Reich's ambitions is written on every collapsed building, every burned field, every hollow-eyed survivor she encounters. Food is scarce again, not just scarce, nearly absent. The ration cards mean nothing. The shops have destroyed or empty. People are starving in ways that make the wartime shortages look mild by comparison. She uses the rations from the American camp carefully, trading some for information, some for shelter, eating little herself to make them last. The irony isn't lost on her. She's surviving the peace on food the enemy gave her. She finally makes it to her hometown, or what's left of it. Half the buildings are gone. The ones still standing are damaged, windows blown out, roofs collapsed. She finds her family's apartment. The building is standing, barely. The door hangs crooked on its hinges.
Inside, the apartment has been looted, abandoned. No sign of her family, no note, no indication of where they went or if they survived. She sits in what used to be her bedroom and cries. Not loud, dramatic crying, just tears licking out while she sits on the floor surrounded by the wreckage of her former life. She's alive. She survived. But survival doesn't feel like victory. It just feels like endurance.
In the weeks that followed, she searches displaced persons camps, Red Cross lists, message boards where survivors post notes looking for family. She finds fragments, a neighbor who saw her mother heading west, a cousin who thinks her brother might have been captured by the Soviets. Her father is dead, killed in an air raid. The details are sparse, unreliable, but they're all she has. She ends up in a DP camp, another camp, different from the American POW camp, but similar in its liminal quality, a place between what was and what will be. She works in exchange for food and shelter. The work is physical, cleaning, cooking, hauling water. It keeps her body occupied while her mind processes everything that's happened. Years pass, not smoothly, not easily, but they pass. Germany rebuilds slowly, painfully. She finds work, finds a place to live, finds a routine. She reconnects with her mother eventually, in 1948. They hug and cry and then don't know what to say to each other. Too much has happened. The gap between who they were and who they've become is too wide to bridge easily. She doesn't talk about the war much. Most people don't. It's easier to focus on rebuilding, on moving forward, on forgetting. But some things don't forget. Some memories persist with a clarity that time doesn't diminish. The smell of bacon is one of them. Decades later, when she's older and the war is history rather than living memory, she'll tell her grandchildren about it. They're sitting in her small apartment, comfortable and warm, eating dinner she's prepared. The grandchildren are curious about the war in the way young people are, distant curiosity about events that shaped their world but feel impossibly remote. What was it like, they ask, being a prisoner? She's quiet for a long moment, trying to find words for something that was never about words. There was a smell, she finally says. The first morning in the American camp. Bacon frying. I hadn't smelled bacon in years. Real bacon, not ersatz or imagination. Just bacon. The grandchildren wait for more. They expect trauma, horror, the stories they've heard about other camps, other prisoners. But she shakes her head. That smell, she continues, it broke something open. Everything we'd been told about the Americans, that they were brutal, that they were savages, it was all propaganda. And the propaganda collapsed because of breakfast, because they fed us, because they treated us like humans instead of enemies. That smell meant we'd been lied to, about everything. One grandchild asks if she was angry about the lies. She considers this. Yes, she says finally, but also grateful. Grateful that the truth turned out to be less terrible than the lies. Grateful that the enemy had bacon to spare while we were starving. Strange thing to be grateful for, isn't it? The smell became a marker in her memory, a before and after point. Before bacon, she was one person, a German woman who believed what she'd been told, who served the Reich, who accepted the propaganda. After bacon, she was someone else, someone who questioned, who doubted, who understood that nations lie and humans are more complex than ideology allows. She kept that lesson, carried it through her life, taught it in quiet ways to her children and grandchildren. Be suspicious of anyone who tells you the enemy is entirely evil. Be wary of propaganda that paints entire groups as monsters. Remember that humans are humans, regardless of nationality,
regardless of uniform. Remember that small acts of decency can mean more than grand gestures. Remember that sometimes the truth arrives not through argument, but through the senses. A smell, a taste, a moment of unexpected kindness. The bacon smell, she realized over time, wasn't really about food. It was about the moment when certainty cracked, when the framework she'd been given to understand the world proved inadequate, when she had to begin the long, difficult process of building a new understanding from scratch. That process took years. It involved shame, guilt, grief, anger. It involved accepting responsibility while also acknowledging that she'd been manipulated, that she'd been young, that she'd been trapped in a system that allowed no escape. Other women from that camp, the ones she occasionally reconnected with over the years, remembered the same moment. They'd talk about it sometimes, carefully, when the conversation drifted toward the war. The bacon smell, the shock of it, the way it upended everything. It became a shared touchstone, a moment when their personal histories intersected with something larger, the collapse of an ideology, the end of a world, the beginning of understanding. Some of the women handled it better than others. Some managed to build new lives, to integrate the experience, to move forward. Others never recovered from the cognitive dissonance, from the guilt, from the weight of realization. She fell somewhere in the middle. She survived. She functioned. But she never forgot, and forgetting wasn't really the point anyway. The point, if there was one, was to remember truthfully, to remember that humans are capable of terrible things, but also of small decencies, to remember that propaganda works until it doesn't, and when it stops working, the collapse is devastating. To remember that war destroys more than buildings and bodies. It destroys certainty, belief, the easy categories that make the world manageable. She's old now. The war is history. The American soldiers who guarded that camp are old too, if they're still alive. The world has moved on, become something new, faced new conflicts. But memory persists, scent memory especially. Even now, decades removed, if she smells bacon frying, and she does sometimes at breakfast in her daughter's house or in a cafe, she's transported back. Not fully, not completely, but enough. Enough to remember the cold morning, the barracks, the shock of the smell, the moment when everything changed. The moment when she realized that the enemy was more human than her own leaders, that captivity could mean safety, that kindness could come from unexpected places, that breakfast, simple breakfast, could carry the weight of moral revelation. That's what she tells her grandchildren in the end. Not to details of battles or politics or the grand sweep of history. Just the story of a smell, a moment, a turning point that was personal but also larger than personal. The moment when bacon stopped being about hunger and became about humanity, about truth, about the complicated ways people survive not just war, but the aftermath of war. She finishes her story. The grandchildren are quiet, processing. They're too young to fully understand, but they're listening. That's enough. The story is told. The memory is passed on. The bacon smell, which changed her life 70 years ago, continues to do its work, reminding, teaching, forcing reconsideration. Because that's what human moments do, even in war, especially in war. They persist. They resonate. They refuse to be forgotten. A scent on a cold morning, the smell of breakfast in an enemy camp, The moment when propaganda met reality and shattered. The beginning of understanding that would take a lifetime to fully comprehend. She smiles at her grandchildren, a small, sad smile that carries decades of memory. Never underestimate small moments, she tells them. Sometimes they're the ones that matter most. Sometimes a smell can change everything. Sometimes the enemy feeds you bacon, and your whole understanding of the world has to be rebuilt from that point forward.
The grandchildren nod, file the story away in their minds alongside other fragments of family history. They'll think about it later, maybe. Or maybe they won't fully understand until they face their own moments of moral reversal, their own confrontations with certainty crumbling. But the story's there now, planted, waiting. She watches them finish their dinner. The apartment is warm, there's enough food. The world outside is peaceful, or peaceful enough. Germany has been rebuilt, transformed, integrated into a new Europe. The old hatreds have been carefully managed, channeled into remembrance and education rather than revenge. It's not perfect, nothing ever is, but it's better, so much better than the world she grew up in. Sometimes she wonders about the American soldiers from that camp. Did they know what they were doing? Did they understand that feeding prisoners well wasn't just practical or required by the Geneva Convention, but was actually a form of psychological warfare more effective than any propaganda campaign? Probably not. Probably they were just following orders, doing their jobs, cooking breakfast because breakfast needed to be cooked. The bacon wasn't strategic. It was just bacon. But that's the point, isn't it? The most powerful moments aren't always the intentional ones. They're the accidental revelations, the unplanned confrontations with reality. The Americans weren't trying to break German ideology by serving bacon. They were just being themselves. A nation with enough resources to feed its prisoners, a military with enough discipline to treat captives humanely. Soldiers who'd been raised in a culture where abundance was normal and cruelty wasn't. The contrast did the work. Germany's propaganda had painted a picture of American weakness, chaos, brutality. But the reality was organization, plenty, and casual decency. The disconnect was impossible to reconcile, so something had to give. And what gave was belief. Not all at once, not completely, but enough. Enough to start the long process of questioning. She thinks about the other camps, the ones that weren't American. The Soviet camps, where German prisoners died by the thousands, worked to death in Siberian labor camps, disappeared into a system that saw them as less than human. The concentration camps that Germany itself had built, where the industrialization of murder had proceeded with terrible efficiency. Her own nation's capacity for cruelty revealed in its full horror after the war ended. The bacon moment exists in the context of all of this. It matters because of what it wasn't. It wasn't Auschwitz. It wasn't Dachau. It wasn't Bergen-Belsen. It was a POW camp where prisoners got breakfast and weren't tortured and went home afterward. The basic, minimal humanity of it stands in stark contrast to the inhumane systems that surrounded it. She's thought about this a lot over the years. The question of what she deserved. Whether German prisoners deserved humane treatment given what Germany had done. The moral calculus of it. She's never found a satisfying answer. Part of her thinks they deserved whatever they got. Punishment, suffering, retribution. Another part recognizes that the American approach, the humane approach, was actually more devastating to the ideology than revenge would have been. Revenge would have confirmed the propaganda. It would have let German prisoners remain victims, would have let them keep their certainty about who was right and who was wrong. But kindness? Kindness forced a reckoning. Kindness made it impossible to maintain the narrative. Kindness demanded acknowledgement that the enemy was better than you were, that their system worked better than yours, that maybe, just maybe, you'd been on the wrong side all along. That's a harder thing to live with than suffering. Suffering can be endured. Suffering can be worn as a badge.
But the knowledge that you were wrong, that you served evil while believing it was good, that the people you thought were monsters turned out to be more decent than your own leaders, that's corrosive. That eats at you. That requires a lifetime of processing. She's made her peace with it mostly, acknowledges her complicity while also acknowledging her youth, her manipulation, the limited choices available to her. She wasn't blameless, but she wasn't a monster either. She was a human being caught in a system that turned humans into machines of war. The bacon smell reminded her of her humanity, reminded her that she was more than a soldier, more than a German, more than a prisoner. She was a person who remembered Sunday mornings in her mother's kitchen, a person who could be moved by a scent, a person who could change, could question, could grow. The evening grows late. Her grandchildren prepare to leave. They hug her goodbye, promise to visit again soon. After they're gone, she sits in her chair by the window and looks out at the street below. Cars pass, people walk. The ordinary flow of life in a city that was once rubble and is now rebuilt. She thinks about memory and how it works, how certain moments become crystallized, perfect in their clarity, while years of life blur into vague impressions. The bacon smell is one of those crystallized moments. She can still reconstruct it with perfect sensory accuracy. The cold air, the thin mattress beneath her, the wooden walls, the exact quality of the light coming through the window, and then the smell arriving like a message from another world. Why that moment and not others? Why does the brain select certain experiences to preserve in such detail? She suspects it's because that moment was a hinge point, a before and after. The moment when one version of herself ended and another began. Those transformation moments get encoded differently. They become reference points, ways of organizing the chaos of memory into something like a narrative. Her life story has several hinge points. The day war was declared, the day she joined the Auxiliary Corps, the day of capture, the bacon smell, the day the war ended, the day she found her mother, the day she met her husband, years later, another survivor trying to build a life from ruins, the day her daughter was born. Each moment a pivot, a redirection, a new chapter beginning. But the bacon smell remains the strangest of these moments, the most unexpected. Who would have thought that breakfast could be life-changing? Who would have imagined that a simple scent could carry such weight? She remembers a conversation she had years ago with a historian researching German POW experiences. The historian was interested in the psychological impact of capture, the process of ideological transformation. She told him about the bacon, and he got very excited, started taking notes rapidly. This is exactly what I'm looking for. These small, concrete details that illustrate larger patterns. The way sensory experiences can trigger cognitive shifts. Do you mind if I include this in my research? She agreed, though she felt odd about it, her private memory becoming academic data. But maybe that was appropriate. Maybe these experiences needed to be documented, studied, understood, not to justify anything or excuse anything, but to understand how humans work, how propaganda functions, how it fails, how people change. The historian explained something to her that she'd found helpful. He talked about cognitive dissonance, the psychological discomfort that occurs when you hold contradictory beliefs, or when your beliefs conflict with your experiences. The greater the dissonance, the more pressure there is to resolve it somehow, either by changing your beliefs, or by rejecting the conflicting experience, or by finding some way to rationalize both.
The bacon smell created massive dissonance. Everything she believed said the Americans should be brutal. Everything she experienced said they were decent. The gap was too wide to rationalize, so beliefs had to change. Not instantly, not completely, but the process started there. The crack appeared. And once a crack appears in a foundation, it spreads. The historian had also talked about the importance of small details in historical understanding, how the grand narratives of war, the battles, the strategies, the political decisions, were important, but so were the lived experiences of ordinary people. How someone experienced capture, what they ate, what they smelled, what they felt. These details humanize history, make it real rather than abstract. She appreciated that. She'd always felt that her experience was too small, too personal, too insignificant to matter in the larger story of the war. Millions died, cities were destroyed, nations fell and rose. What did one woman smelling bacon matter against all that? But the historian helped her see that it did matter, because history isn't just the big events. It's also the millions of small human moments that comprise those events. It's the accumulated weight of individual experiences that create collective trauma and collective healing. Her moment with the bacon smell was one tiny thread in an enormous tapestry, but the tapestry is made of threads. She shifts in her chair, feeling the familiar ache in her joints. Old age has its own set of challenges, its own small indignities, but she's grateful for it. Grateful to have lived long enough to see her grandchildren grow, to see Germany transform, to see the European Union form, former enemies becoming partners. Grateful for the chance to process, to understand, to make some kind of meaning from the chaos of her youth. The bacon smell taught her something about meaning, that it's found in unexpected places, that the moments that define us aren't always the dramatic ones we expect, that sometimes a simple breakfast in an enemy camp means more than any speech or ideology or propaganda campaign. She learned to pay attention to small moments after that, to notice the details, the sensory experiences, the tiny human interactions that reveal truth. She taught this to her children, tries to teach it to her grandchildren. Don't just accept the big narratives, she tells them. Don't just believe what you're told. Pay attention to the small things. Notice what contradicts the official story. Trust your senses, trust your experiences. Question certainty. It's not that grand narratives don't matter. They do, but they're not the whole story. And sometimes they're completely wrong. The only way to know is to stay alert to the contradictions, to the moments when reality doesn't match the script. Outside her window, the streetlights flicker on, evening settling into night. She should prepare for bed soon, but she's not ready yet. Still sitting with memory, with the story she told her grandchildren, with the decades between then and now. She wonders what happened to the other women from that camp. Some she kept in touch with for a while, but people drift apart. Lives go in different directions. Maybe some of them are still alive, sitting in their own apartments, looking out their own windows, remembering the same morning. Maybe some of them smell bacon sometimes and are transported back, just as she is. There's a strange comfort in knowing that her experience was shared, that she wasn't alone in that moment of transformation, that other women felt the same shock, the same confusion, the same slow awakening to the possibility that everything they'd believed was wrong. Shared trauma, yes, but also shared awakening, shared rebuilding of understanding. She thinks about the word enemy, how strange it is, how it takes complex human beings and reduces them to a single dimension: threat, opposition, other. The Americans were supposed to be the enemy, evil, brutal, inhuman, but they were just people. Young men far from home, doing a job, following orders, living their lives. They weren't monsters or heroes, they were just people. That's what the bacon smell revealed. Not that Americans were saints, not that they were perfect, but that they were human, capable of basic decency, organized enough to feed prisoners well, wealthy enough to afford abundance, civilized enough to follow rules of war. Just human. And if they were just human, then maybe everyone was just human. Maybe the whole concept of enemies was a construction, a tool used by nations to motivate war. Maybe underneath all the uniforms and flags and ideologies, there were just people trying to survive, trying to get home, trying to make sense of senseless violence. This realization that the enemy is human should be obvious, but war makes it impossible to see. War requires dehumanization. You can't kill people efficiently if you think of them as fully human. So propaganda works to erase humanity, to turn the enemy into something less than human. The bacon smell reversed that process. It rehumanized the Americans. And once you rehumanize the enemy, you have to re-examine everything. She's tired now. The weight of memory, of the story told, of all these years of carrying this knowledge. She rises slowly from her chair, turns off lights, prepares for bed. The routine is soothing. Brush teeth, wash face, change into nightgown. The simple maintenance of a body that survived so much. In bed, in the dark, she lies still and thinks one more time about that morning. The cold barracks. The other women waking. The smell arriving like a revelation. The walk to the mess hall. The bacon on her tray. The first bite. The taste of fat and salt. And memory. The feeling of everything changing. She's grateful it happened the way it did. Grateful that her experience was by Americans rather than Soviets. Grateful for the bacon, for the kindness, for the humane treatment that allowed her to survive not just physically, but psychologically. Grateful for the crack in certainty that let new understanding grow. But she also carries the weight of knowing that her experience was exceptional. That for every German prisoner who got bacon in an American camp, there were others who died in Soviet camps. For every moment of humane treatment she received, there were Jewish prisoners who received industrialized murder. The scales don't balance. Her survival, her decent treatment, doesn't erase or compensate for the horrors Germany inflicted. This is the complexity she's learned to hold. Multiple truths existing simultaneously. She was a victim and a perpetrator. She suffered and she served a regime that caused suffering. She was manipulated and she was responsible. The Americans were kind to her and ruthless to others. War is chaos, and trying to extract simple moral lessons from chaos is a mistake. But some lessons remain. Pay attention to the small moments. Question what you're told. Trust your senses. Recognize humanity in unexpected places. Don't let ideology override direct experience. Remember that nations lie, propaganda deceives, and sometimes the truth arrives in a simple scent on a cold morning. These lessons, she's realized, are what she has to offer. Not grand wisdom, not sweeping insights, just these small, hard-won understandings. She's passed them to her children. Tonight, she passed them to her grandchildren. Maybe they'll remember. Maybe generations from now, someone will tell the story of a woman who smelled bacon in an enemy camp and realized everything she believed was wrong. Maybe the story will persist, doing its quiet work of complicating certainty.
Sleep comes slowly. When it does, she dreams. Not of the war, not usually. Tonight, though, she dreams of her mother's kitchen, Sunday morning before the war. Bacon sizzling in the pan, her brother stealing a piece, her father laughing, the window fogging. Everything safe and warm and normal. She wakes briefly in the night, disoriented. For a moment, she's not sure where she is. Her childhood home? The POW camp? Her apartment? Memory and present blur together. Then reality settles. She's home. She's safe. She's old. The war is history. She closes her eyes again. The dream returns, different now. She's in the POW camp, but it's not frightening. She's walking to the mess hall on that first morning. The smell of bacon drifts through the air. But this time in the dream, she understands what it means immediately. She's not confused or shocked. She just knows. This is the moment everything changes. This is where the lies end and truth begins. This is where she starts to become herself again. The dream shifts. She's older now, telling the story to her grandchildren. But the kitchen table where they sit gradually transforms into the mess hall table. The grandchildren become the other German women from the camp. Everyone is eating bacon, and everyone understands what it means. There's no need for words. Just the shared knowledge that they've crossed a threshold, that they can never go back to who they were before. She wakes again in the early morning, just before dawn. The apartment is quiet. Outside, the city is beginning to stir. She lies still, letting the dream fade, returning fully to the present. Her body aches in the usual ways. Her mind is clear. She thinks, I am old. I have lived a long time. I've carried this memory for decades. Soon I will die, and the memory will die with me, unless it's preserved somehow. The historian's notes, the story told to grandchildren. These fragments are all that will remain. But maybe that's enough. Maybe the point isn't to preserve every detail perfectly, but to pass on the essential truth. That humans are complex, that certainty is dangerous, that small moments matter, that the enemy might turn out to be more humane than your own side, that a simple smell can crack open understanding, that change is possible, even in the darkest times. The sun rises. Light filters through her curtains. A new day begins. She'll rise soon, make breakfast, go through her routine. But for now, she just lies here, an old woman in a rebuilt city, holding decades of memory, grateful for survival, burdened by knowledge, at peace with complexity. The smell of bacon. It still matters. It will always matter. Not because bacon is important, but because that moment was important. The moment when propaganda met reality and lost. The moment when the enemy fed her breakfast and everything had to be reconsidered. The moment when her life pivoted from one trajectory to another. She carries it forward, this memory, this lesson, this small piece of truth salvaged from the chaos of war. Carries it until she can't carry it anymore. Passes it on in the hope that somewhere, someone will understand what it means. Will remember that history is made of moments like this. Will recognize that truth often arrives unexpectedly in forms as simple as the smell of breakfast cooking on a cold morning in an enemy camp. And maybe, just maybe, we'll learn to question their own certainties, to stay alert for contradictions, to trust their senses when they conflict with what they've been told, to recognize humanity in unexpected places, to understand that the most powerful transformations often come from the smallest experiences. The bacon smell. A simple thing. A human thing. A true thing. She rises from bed, ready to face another day, carrying her story forward into whatever time remains.